I equate the approach of the Indian state in towards Kashmir to how they dealt with the Northeast.
There were foreign states also involved in Naga movement as well as the Mizo movement.
Okay, I mean, I've got my facts from here, but sir, but in a way, it's kind of wrong to bring the apple orange comparison. Maybe it's come across as stupid, so I'm sorry, but this is probably what I've the view that I've got.
I think Mukhtar will cover that.
So, to sort of try and tell you, there was, going back in history, I'm so sorry about this, during the 1965 war and after that, there were certain Pakistani insurgents that came to Kashmir. And it may just surprise you that at that particular point in time, the local Kashmiris held the Indian forces and gave those people away in terms of because they didn't agree with the policies or the methods that they were undertaking. What fundamentally changed the relationship between the local Kashmiris and the Indian populace was which led to the rise of the insurgency and militancy is 1987 elections. There was this particular group of individuals, I think the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front and many others, and this is after the death of Maqbool Bhatt, who is another point altogether. They tried to utilize a democratic framework which is established as per the Indian government in Kashmir and etch out or at least specify their demands, specifically either referendum, plebiscite, or whatever it may be. But what you need to understand is utilizing the democratic framework as agreed upon by the Indian government. So as Arvind also pointed out, like there was already a loss of faith in terms of the trust that Kashmiri people had with the Indian government, owing to the fact that there were rigged elections. Nobody in their right mind would have wanted Farooq Abdullah to be the chief minister, and I can say that categorically. Like nobody. And in this particular election, I think either they were not allowed to contest, owing to the fact that people knew, or the government knew what their ideas were, and even if they did, it was because of the rigged election that this happened, which led to these individuals going to Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which in a larger international scenario, after the removal of the Russians from Afghanistan, there were those individuals in the Islamist zeal, which are sort of taken care of, or at least trained by the United States government. Those guys went ahead and trained these individuals, and which led to the rise of the militancy. And militancy at that particular point in time was very rampant. I think the figures are disputed, but somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 militants at that particular point existed. And arguably, I was reading somewhere, at that particular point in time, the nature of the militants was something along the lines of 2 out of every 3 militants were Pakistani based, or at least had Pakistani origin. Right? Today, if you look at it, the current re-rise in the nature of militancy and armed forces, this is after the arguably secular, non-violent movement that happened in 2008, 2009, 2010, and later on. What has happened is right now, out of the 150 militants that exist, 2 out of every 3 is a local Kashmiri. So you understand the nature of this enchantment and the reason why, after multiple means of utilizing democratic framework, non-violent protest, these people, realizing the fact that nothing was going to happen, went to this fairly abrasive and retarded form of struggle. And that sort of to contextualize it for you, so that you understand this is exactly how it has been.
Okay. Yeah, so I have fundamental problems with that. Because one, so I mean, fine, the rigged election thing is fiercely debated. I don't feel the elections were rigged in the first place. And the point is, the problem there was the democratically elected government of Kashmir was not able to perform its duties in keeping certain citizens safe, and those certain citizens were the Hindus sitting in Kashmir. And when you fail to do that, and they themselves called in the military, and they themselves asked for the ASPA to be applied initially. They passed their own law, temporarily. But, briefly, but they did at that point of time feel it was necessary because the entire law and order situation was not under their control, and their police could not manage it. And that's where the problems start. You get this post from the rest of India to manage law and order, and the army is not meant for enforcing law and order. The army is for handling struggles against. Even the CRPF is supposed to be for a temporary period, and it's not supposed to last for 20 years. The reason it has lasted for 20 years is because, in my opinion at least, is the fact that the J&K police has proved inept, and the state government has proved inept in this regard. I feel that the 2009 elections were a great opportunity, and the 2009 elections when Omar Abdullah got elected, and there was a decline in militancy by then, and it was relatively peaceful. We were able to withdraw some forces from Kashmir. That was a great opportunity for Kashmir to move forward and actually establish I mean, that was a democratic success, and he managed to get the Sarpanch elections done, and the Sarpanch elections were, I mean, hugely successful. And that's what, I mean, I feel that would have been the best solution, like sort of so said, like the democratic process, like sort of making sure that things move forward. But the fact is, at this point of time, when the militants went and said, like, I mean, the Sarpanches either stepped down or they died, then Farooq Abdullah and the democratically elected government there did not manage to back them. They didn't manage to support them, and like they didn't feel safe. Like a lot of them died, and after that, the rest of them also backed down. And that for me is the inflection point. That's why we are in this situation here, because back then, if they'd managed to promote like law and order in that area through the JNK police, train them properly so that they can manage it, and like apart from that, like sort of promote industry at that point of time, which they again didn't do. And I feel like, I mean, this is also another problem because, like with regard to industry, I mean, my father actually went in there for like establishing a press over there, and then the only like for the Tribune, which is like a national newspaper, and like the fact that they wanted them to also get like the national a sense of what's happening around India, and they felt that there was a market there for that, and they go in there and they tell them that like, okay, we are not going to give you a printing press, you must have a tie-up with a local newspaper. So they refuse to grant that license. They sort of send them over to these to basically like some people running local Kashmiri newspapers, and those guys were obviously not keen on having any competition there. So basically an industry that could have been formed there was not formed because the government was like sort of more into protecting these vested interests in that area, and that is very dangerous for like a country which is like anyway not an attractive destination for investment. And I mean something like that, if you manage to promote some industry there, it could have done something. But
I just want to quickly just on this rigged elections aspect, and before that I just want to appreciate what Saurabh sir said, and the only reason we visited the 50s is just to show how we have violated promise after promise. Now we're just going to the rigged election part. Even if one doesn't want to believe it, just three sources I want to give. One is a person Saurabh sir just quoted, Bajat Habibullah. He was a divisional commissioner in Kashmir there, and of 9 districts, by the way. And in his book, Kashmir Dying Light, clearly specifies how he was instructed to help in the rigging of the elections. The governor of the state, B.K. Nehru, in his book, pages 214 to 15, says about how they rigged elections. A Congress chief minister, Mir Kazim, in his own book, My Life and Times, admits that his election was rigged. 1988, where Farooq Abdullah won that election, Farooq Abdullah himself admits it was rigged, but he says I didn't rig it. That's the only difference. And I think we also have to remember that, it's when you feel that the democratic process isn't working, that's when people go into militancy. The 88 elections Mukeet spoke about, there were 2 important people who contested that elections, Saeed Salahuddin, Yasin Malik. And they were part of what was the party known as the MUF. And that was a rigged election. And after that election was rigged, militancy really rose, and Saeed Salahuddin goes on to head the Hizbul Mujahideen. And Yasin Malik goes on to head the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front. And I think you also need to have certain facts about how the central government has been dealing with the state government, okay? And one is, for example, just very simple facts. I know it's taking a lot of time. I'll just give 3 facts. One is, in 1983, Farooq Abdullah refuses Indira Gandhi's offer to enter into an electoral alliance. You know what she does? 1984, she pushes down what is called Operation New Star, not Operation Blue Star, which was her fatal decision, but Operation New Star, in which the government bribed members of the National Conference. There was a defection, and she wanted the then governor, her cousin, B.K. Nehru, to dismiss the government. You know what B.K. Nehru did? He refused. You know what she did? She got rid of B.K. Nehru. She put a new governor, Jagmohan, and had him dismissed. And then brings in his brother-in-law as his chief minister, B.M. Shah, and all those who defected became cabinet ministers. 1986, Rajiv Gandhi becomes very good friends with Farooq Abdullah. What does he do? He dismisses B.M. Shah, brings back Farooq Abdullah in what? The 1988 rigged elections. Or you talk about, for example, in 1990, the VP Singh government forces in Jagmohan despite the state government saying we don't want this guy. Farooq Abdullah resigns in protest. And then, of course, in the 1990s, India creates what is known as the Ikhwanis, and the Ikhwanis were counterinsurgent groups which committed massive human rights violations. And you know who created it? The then director of the IB in Jammu and Kashmir, Achik Doval, who is now a national security advisor. And that group, please go across to the Human Rights Watch report of 1998. which talks in extensive detail about the atrocities committed by the authorities. So, I mean, we can go into all of this in threadbare if we have the time, but the fact remains that we can't just say that, nothing happened. These are not facts in the air. There are clearly injustices taking place, even as late as 2009, when the report, or 2011, sorry, the report of one of the human rights tribunals came out detailing 2,900 unmarked graves. All they said is investigated, deny it, whatever, investigated. Why couldn't you do that? Why couldn't the government investigate it? Or talk about 1990s, the numerous massacres. Sir just spoke about a funeral where a massacre took place, right? Do you know that during that funeral, when the shooting happens, the bullets were found inside the body of the person's funeral? It was to that extent. And you have numerous cases of riots after massacres one after the other, when Jagmohan was the governor there. And what do? We give him a Padma Vibhushan. Is this how you think when you do things like this, how the Kashmiris will feel there? So it's clearly there's been injustice taking place in Kashmir. And if you want, and there's no doubt that the Hindu Pandits faced atrocities. And I actually like to hear more about that. But we cannot deny the injustice which conducted. And it's our actions. No doubt Pakistan has a role, but you cannot say it's only Pakistan's role. It's our actions in Kashmir which has helped develop this militancy. And as Sir said, earlier there would have been people who may not have wanted Azadi, but because of these atrocities committed, even now they speak about it. And
Just take 1 minute. On the question of mass graves, I'd like to make a clarification and in some sense of responsibility, given that I was working within a group which was associated with disappeared persons. There's an impression given on the IP that tribunal report also added. We need to make a distinction between mass graves and unmarked graves. The notion of mass graves evokes memories of Yugoslavia and Bosnia, where thousands and thousands were slaughtered at one go. What we have found, or what was found in Kashmir, were not mass graves. They were unmarked graves, which were people buried without identification. And clearly that speaks of human rights violation, that clearly speaks of people who were picked up and killed. But let's not confuse that with mass grave. And we also need to understand most of the Pakistani infiltrators who were killed were all unidentified militants who were buried. So this would also include a large number of those Pakistani terrorists as well. So we need to make a distinction between unmarked graves, and which also speaks of human rights violation, and mass graves, which are human rights crime of a much higher gravity. And I think we need to be a little more rigorous even as we criticize the Indian state.
I think Abhimanyu and Anirudh have something to add, and then we'll move on to the two comments.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say like about 2 lines, and after that Anirudh can go. So basically, all I'm saying is the picture that Arvind has painted of the 80s is like has to be taken in light of the context that Ghulam Muhammad Shah dismissed basically overthrew the Sheikh Abdullah government at that point of time, and after that he's the one who came to power. He was very acerbic. After that he made essentially within the temple he tried to make a mosque. And that was very after that there were protests and the demonstrations in the streets, and that was the context in which that government was dismissed in the first place. After that, when Ghulam Muhammad Shah comes back in 88, I think, I don't know. So when he comes back, he comes in and says that Islam is under threat from Hindu forces. And after that, that's when the targeting of the Kashmiri Pandits started, and that was the sort of precursor to the ethnic cleansing that happened in the 90s. And that's also
I actually completely agree with Azari on this. What's more necessary to possibly acknowledge is that it doesn't make logical sense that if elections were rigged in 87, then only one people belonging to a certain religion are actually eliminated from the valley. It doesn't make any logical sense, because if there was any cause for Antigone against these people, it should have been Farooq Abdullah to start with. Now what had happened in 87 was it's debated now. Arvind has pointed out facts that possibly tell you that the elections were rigged. But what nobody wants to talk about is the religious flavor of this conflict at all, and the fact that it is a political conflict, yes, but it is also majorly a religious conflict. Because let us understand who are these poster boys of Kashmiri independence. Let us understand who are these organizations. You have the Muslim United Front, that was completely militant organization even in the 80s. Then you have the JKLF, you have the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front. Who was it headed by? It was headed by this guy called Yasin Malik. What did Yasin Malik do? Yasin Malik was actually involved in the rape of Sarla Bhatt. Her breasts were chopped off. She was gang raped for 5 days. This is Yasin Malik, by the way. Let us understand who else. Now, you have the Hizbul Mujahideen. Now, Hizbul Mujahideen is headed by Sayyid Salahuddin. Now, there are people over here who possibly eulogize Burhan Wani and say that, well, okay, fine, he was a social media activist and he was a martyr in Kashmir and he was espousing for the rights of the Kashmiris. Now, what does the Hizbul Mujahideen stand for? Do you know the number of attacks the Hizbul Mujahideen has been involved in? Pathankot, to give you one example, was an example of the Hizbul Mujahideen being involved. The massacre of the CRPF personnel in 2013 was another attack in which Hizbul Mujahideen was involved in. And not long ago, only 3 days back, they had killed 3 BSF Jawans also. So this is the Hizbul Mujahideen, right? Burhan Wani was a commander of the Hizbul Mujahideen, right? Burhan Wani stood for the Hizbul Mujahideen. Therefore, Burhan Wani was a terrorist and he died as a terrorist, right? And this is exactly what people need to understand over here. More importantly, now let us also one more thing. Now this entire concept of this entire dispute about unmarked graves, right? Now there's this article that has been I think it's an article written by Lieutenant General N.S. Malik in the Indian Defence Review. I think it's 18th May 2013. I might be wrong, but it is definitely an article in the Indian Defence Review, which gives you a counter narrative and another reason as to why these unmarked graves exist. Now you need to understand that just another source. Now you need to understand that the Hizbul Mujahideen was actually very potent in the 1980s, and as it is very potent right now. It had given advertisements and slogans in the local newspapers of Kashmir asking all the Hindus to leave or convert. There were slogans such as Kashmir with Hindu women but without Hindu men. These were the slogans that were actually propagated by the Hizbul Mujahideen at that time. Owen Murphy, in his book on the rise of terrorism in Pakistan, actually chronicles the Pakistan link between Hizbul Mujahideen and tells you that the Hizbul Mujahideen is fundamentally funded by the Pakistanis. Now, how many of you have actually seen the video of Burhan Wani's funeral? I mean, I just want to know, a show of hands. Like, okay, so you guys have seen the video of Burhan Wani's funeral. What does it tell you? There were Pakistani flags. Now, Arvind spoke to you about the massive outpour of people in Kashmir. There were Pakistani flags over there. You had Hafiz Saeed, who was actually telling you that it was very unfortunate. You had the Pakistani government who criticized the Indian government for the death of Burhan Wani. And there were open slogans against the Indian state. There were open slogans in favor of the state of Pakistan. And all these things need to be contextualized, because when you're talking about people like Burhan Wani, when you're talking about Kashmiri independence, you need to understand that the primary symbol of this Kashmiri independence, which I'm telling you, it is a political struggle, but it is also fundamentally a religious struggle to start with, which is why if you look at the slogans of these separatists, it's called they premise all their doings on the Nizam-e-Mustafa. What is the Nizam-e-Mustafa? The Nizam-e-Mustafa is the rule of Allah, and this is all these supposed separatists have to say about Kashmir. Now you need to understand that the exodus of the Kashmiri Hindus at that time was primarily motivated by these desires, and there was a very potent nexus with another neighboring state, which nobody, which a lot of people are not willing to acknowledge. Therefore, I do understand that Kashmir is a political dispute, yes, which is why we had this entire discourse on the Kashmiri history. But we also need to call a spade and stop mincing words. Thank you.
I think Indrajit had a question.
Before, like in this kind of a panel discussion, it's important that we take another stakeholder, that is the common people, right? Layman. I'm a first year student, 1 month into law school. I've interacted with like one of the panel members about the Kashmir issue. So now the thing is that what is going on here right now is it's a privilege, right? We're sitting here, we're talking about Kashmir, we are having like a peek into the history. Like, just to point out something, what Mukit said was that you people talked about the 15th century, about how like people try to justify today's alienation and give a historical context to it, right? That we have been alienated over a period of time. So I have a problem with that because you see, India was a country which was we were subjugated for 200 years, right? So today, if I feel alienated and if I say that Sirajuddaula was forced out of Bengal in 1757, so I do not really think that we can discuss Kashmir in the dynamics of the past. So I think that is one thing the panel members are avoiding today, the discussion of Kashmir in today's power dynamics. And the second comment which I wanted to make was that, see, you have to understand what affects laymen. You see, today when you wake up, you are reading the power dynamics of Kashmir. Yes, you take interest in it, but it doesn't affect you. What affects you is when like people die in like a 26/11 in Mumbai, right? It affects you when you see people dying in terrorist attacks, and then you are scared of terrorists, and then you read that Kashmiris or people in Kashmir are sympathizing with a terrorist. You see, that is what affects laymen. So today, when you wake up in the morning and see that 1 lakh people have turned out for the funeral of Burhan Wani, that affects the layman. Today, when you wake up and you see that every Friday the people come onto the streets after the mosque and they throw bricks at the Indian army, that affects you. Today, when you see that these people come to Scoop Whoop, media we subscribe to, the media associates with, they come up there, they openly say that yeah, we are paid 10,000 rupees to chuck bricks at the army, and when this person asks that why, he says that pata nahi humko Pakistan zindabad and Pakistan jana hai, and they unfurl the ISIS flag. That affects you because that is what they are concerned with, because that is what the layman fears. Terrorism, right? Terrorists. The politics, the power dynamics doesn't affect us on day to day. So my request to the panel is to discuss the Kashmir issue in today's power dynamics, like in 2016 oriented.
Thank you, Anjali. I think that has a response.
Before I just want to respond to what both Saurabh sir and Lekhi and Hazari said. Yes, I agree, sir. Thank you for pointing out there's a distinction between unmarked graves and mass graves. But the only simple point I wanted to make there was the request was for an investigation into it, and that was never done. That is the main point I wanted to make. And another point regarding what Lekhi has elaborately discussed, no one is eulogizing these terrorists. But merely because they have done certain atrocities doesn't mean we also ignore the atrocities the government has committed, right? Atrocities have been committed on both sides, but two wrongs don't make one right. So we shouldn't be here trying to justify any of these atrocities. And yes, if there were charges of such against Yasin Malik, I think that should have been investigated and taken to book. It doesn't justify going ahead and rigging elections if he's contesting. And both sides, Salahuddin and Yasin Malik, contested those elections. And as I said, even Farooq Abdullah said that those elections, a person who's a victor of the elections, says that my own election was rigged. Although, as I said, he doesn't say he's the one to blame. And yes, and regarding what happened to the Pandits, no one is trying to condone it. But at the same time, I believe that when we're talking about what happened to Pandits, and that's an issue we haven't discussed in detail, and I'd really like to hear more from Hazari and others about what happened at that time. It's also important to remember that someone like Jagmohan, who was a governor at that time, he writes in his own book, My Frozen Turbulence with Kashmir. He writes in his own book that between 1989 and 1990, he quotes his ADGP for this, that 71 Hindu Pandits were killed, and at the same time 63 Muslims were also killed. So it's true the Pandits were targeted, but at the same time even liberal secular Muslims were also attacked who tried to protect these Pandits. And that's a fact also we tend to forget at times. And again, I just want to repeat again, no one is condoning the activities of the terrorists. And as you said, why are lakhs of people going to a terrorist funeral? The reason is we have to understand this history of the Ikhwanis, of these atrocities committed, and people there feel, they relate to someone like Burhan Wani. And I'm not condoning anything he's done. But you have to understand why. There's no point of us just getting angry about that people are going for a funeral. You have to understand that. And understanding the problem is the first step to finding a solution.
And that's literally the point I was trying to make. I do not completely agree with what Burhan Wani did, but firstly, you can't. You need to understand it's understandable if you call it Hizbul Mujahideen and what any person associated with Hizbul Mujahideen is wrong. I agree, fine, if you call it that. Historically, this particular group might not conduct an insane number of atrocities. But in case you don't have enough evidence to see, understand it from a Kashmiri point of view, alright? The narrative that you have, and what you've been told every day, Kashmir is an integral part of India. The fact that Indian army is doing it because there are terrorists everywhere, and all such things obfuscate the reality. And in addition to that, there's also a disjunct that exists between the Kashmiri narrative and the Indian state narrative. And one of the primary reasons why, so if you put it in context of why the 2008 struggle was very different, fundamentally different from the 1990 struggle, is because of the open access that was provided to individuals. Internet, you cannot understand how important it is, because it allowed Kashmiris to understand what the narrative is from the Indian state and what they knew, what they believed for the longest time, and could counter that narrative. And allowing that particular space allowed them to utilize different forms of expression. For example, there was a guy called MC Cash who started rap songs in 2008. There were documentaries made about whatever's happened, and other such like writings, insane number of writings, and that sort of changed the nature of the struggle that existed. Alright. So, and coming back to the whole, one of the primary reasons what is fundamentally wrong with the approach that's been taken by the Indian state is deploy an armed force. Alright. I understand the reasons for it. There are considerable. You think that these people are against you and everything else. You put them in place. What happens is the paramilitary and military forces are fundamentally operate on a basis that they understand the enemy. There is a distinction between what is an Indian, and if you're talking about India and Pakistan, you understand where Pakistanis come from, you know who they are, and at least there's a specification as to what your target is. In Kashmir, that sort of dwindled, and the dwindling was because of the narrative that the people who are in the army have, and also in addition to that, whatever things that they saw. The fact that you cannot determine who's a civilian and who's a militant. It may, for one person, speak about how messed up the whole state is, so much so that everybody has that kind of narrative, or it may just be a fundamental flaw in the way you're operating in that particular region. If you're utilizing armed forces and you treat these individuals as citizens, then how can you go ahead and kill those individuals who allegedly, if you give into the argument that Kashmir is an integral part of India, are citizens of this nation, have Article 921 basically, like, forget everything else, forget freedom of speech and expression, right to life. It's a fundamental right which every Indian citizen has. I'm not saying that, and under no circumstances am I in particular, like, I do not espouse any of these views, but that doesn't mean that I don't understand the problems that exist. The fact is, at the end of the day, you don't make a distinction between a civilian and a militant. You go about it in an indiscriminate manner, which has led to the alienation of this particular population. Now, talking about Burhan Wani, where did Burhan Wani come from? Have you ever thought about that? I'm sure Lekhi has, and everybody else here understands where he came from. And you may not condone what he has done and what he ends up doing, but you understand where he's coming from. He's coming from a place. He lives in he was actually a very well-read individual because his father was a principal of a school. His brother was a PhD doctor. He had a doctorate or something, and he was a very well-read man. I'm stretching it a little bit too much on Burhan Wani because he's become a figure right now, and for you to understand where it's coming from. He was stopped by the military, asked to get cigarettes. They were beaten up. His brother was later on, when after the kind of aggression and oppression he faced, because in Kashmir, once you grow up in Kashmir, you need to understand that at every roadside, at every bunker, there's military. Right? Your whole life is shaped by viewing a gun and knowing the fact that at the end of the day, in case you step out, for example, in a curfew, there are shoot-strike orders, and there will be no recourse your family will have to challenge those kind of actions. In addition to that, there's another interesting notion. I don't know if you guys have heard of this thing called half widows. Have you heard of it? Half widows are basically women whose husbands have been detained under the relevant laws, Public Safety Act, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and many others, which and they've been detained, so you can't know who they are. You can't legally go after them because these people have not died and there's no certificate of death. Therefore, these widows cannot get pensions. You may just completely ignore this whole aspect of it, but these are small kind of struggles that emanate from arguably the administration that's been carried on in Kashmir. Now coming back to, alright, we can go into the main part of the show.
Okay, I think Kushagra had a question. I'll just take it.
Not so much question as my general comment. To build on what Muki
essentially means, and this is a problem with Indian media in general as of now, is how we are saying that yes, Burhan Wani is a terrorist, and yes, terrorists exist, and therefore that is bad, and conveniently ignoring why Kashmiri people inherently are becoming terrorists in this situation, right? And this comes from the view of a Kashmiri Pandit, and I have huge problems with what Azari has portrayed today, right? As a Kashmiri Pandit over here, in the sense that, let's go back to your history, right? If you've read the Raja Talmini, and I don't know if you have or not, it safely says that there were reports of Muslims coexisting with Hindus at that point of time, right? And Kalhana writes very emphatically over there that the nature of the spirit of the people of Kashmir is such that it can never be subdued by force, but can only be won by spiritual conquest. Alright, so there is a patron saint of Kashmir, I don't know what his name, Badal Wadi, I'm not sure of what. Right. That person has legitimately converted something, and I have a record of this because my family has always been something of a writers. So we've got this entire record at home of my family's conversions to Islam. And within that, there was a person called Tadi Rena, if I'm not incorrect, who, following this patron saint of Kashmir, converted to Islam, and therefore followed her about 12,000 people who then migrated into Islam, right? So this nature that you deny that it was an organic change is completely completely false. Yes, I cannot say that there wasn't like a massacre or whatever, those 80-90 years of two rulers' reign. But before that, there was organic change, and naturally people were shifting to Islam. And this comes from a Kashmiri Pandit. But more than that, what Burhan Wani essentially was, and I think Mukeet just didn't completely express what the emotions of this story were, so I'm just going to try and do it, right? He was maybe 16 or 17 years old when he, his brother, and his friend took a bike and went out because, hey, it's Kashmir. Who's not going to go on a bike in the snow, right? They were stopped by the military personnel over there. They were forced to go and buy cigarettes. That itself would have been enough for a riot in Bombay, which is where I come from, or a riot in this college right now, right? But they went ahead, they got cigarettes, they came back. Then their bike was broken by the army officers over there. Then they were beaten. Why? Because the army can do that, and because there's nothing you can do about it. Because there is absolutely no recourse you have in this process, right? This is in the face of the fact that there are things like half widows, there are 120 people being killed daily, there is this entire idea that after 6 o'clock you cannot step out because you will be shot, which is something my father has faced, so I know exactly how dangerous it is. And in face of that, is it not fascinating that the Indian media does not at all look at why Kashmiris are changing as to the culture as it was, right? And I find this a problem on this side of the house, which is till the 80s, we've all agreed that Kashmiri Muslims and Hindus lived in harmony, right? And you say that in 87, because of the rigged election, there was a massive change. What that fails to understand, this is the Kashmiri Pandit, is why would a common man's perspective change on his neighbor living over there, right? Before, as I may finish, right? The idea was that, my family was a landowning family at that point of time. My great-grandfather was a doctor and also owned a bunch of land. And I do agree with your feudalist aspect because he had a bunch of slaves and an asshole about it. And I know that, right, as a fact. But more than that, his brother was a doctor, and his brother stayed up a whole night saving a butcher from dying as a surgeon, right? 3 days later, that butcher chopped his head off and he died because of the entire 85 to 95 mass killings that happened in the exodus that followed in that period of time, right? What I find fascinating is why a change in Indian politics will affect this entire change between the relation between a butcher and a doctor who just saves his life. And therefore I find it really hard to harmonize the fact that Kashmiri Pandits had to leave and are not taken back, and their views now are largely discounted when we talk about the future of Kashmir.
I think Abhimanyu wants to respond to that first.
Excuse me, we have been waiting for comments for like 15
No, I
minutes.
understand.
Yeah, so maybe take comments from us also instead of just going in one narrative all along.
You want to speak?
The point is, you are, I mean, Arvind, I'm going to address your point. Okay, fine, Arvind, I just want to address your point. You're talking about discontentment of Kashmiri people. You're talking about how they got their bikes broken, how they had to go buy cigarettes. No. The general narrative right now, how we can't go out in curfew, and how political leaders were incarcerated, and there was no democracy. What do you think was happening in Bihar at that point? What is Lalu Yadav's daughter's name? No, and what do you think was the curfew situation in Bihar at that point? Even until the late 90s. No, even until the late 90s. Even until the late 90s, the law and order situation in Bihar was very bad, right? But there, no one grows up against the Indian government. No one demanded independence. And if you have certain issues, if you have certain violations of democracy, why don't you hold individuals responsible? Since when did it become the Indian government against the Kashmiri people? If Ajit Doval did something, say Ajit Doval should be held responsible. Why do you say it's a problem on the Indian government?
First of all, I didn't mention about the bikes and incarceration. That was from Mukit, but no matter that, I agree with that point of, you have to also look at the history as to why the Kashmiris are doing this way. Yes, Bihar, that may have happened. Gujarat, something may have happened. Madhya Pradesh, it may have happened. But the issue is, you cannot compare the two because they have different histories. The issue of Bihar is very different from Kashmir, and that's why my entire point of going as early as 1940. Please don't look at these matters in the vacuum. It's not that because some massacre happened here, why weren't there any terrorists there? Some massacre happened in Gujarat, why aren't there any terrorists there? It doesn't work that way. And let's, we're trying to evade the main issue there. When we're talking about why the Kashmiris are feeling a certain way, we have to address it, right? Do we have to get into this extreme, this tutu me, this whole discussion? It's because of you, it's because of me, but also on the pundits point which you spoke about. I actually want to hear more about what happened because I am also very unsure as to the reason. I'm not saying that the 88 elections is the only reason for that. You also have to remember, there were the Caravan brought out a brilliant piece on Mufti Muhammad Said, and where they talk about Mufti Muhammad Said's alleged role in fomenting this feeling against the Pandits as well, because he wanted to try and discredit the GM Shah government at that time. Then also you have to look at the fact that what is happening in the 80s in the rest of the country. If you remember the late 80s, you have the entire Ram Janmabhoomi issue coming up. That also, it's not that Kashmir is like in another planet, it doesn't affect them. That also creeps up there. But I want to hear much more on that. Then also, of course, an area which we completely forget, what is happening in 80s in the world over. Saudi Arabia's role in funding what is called Wahhabi Islam, which is actually not, I wouldn't even call it Wahhabi Islam. It's Islam followed by someone like Mohammed ibn Saud, who's the founder of the Saudi family, and how that money also comes into Kashmir. It's a very complicated matter. I will never accept the reductionist approach that because of the rigging of 87, 88, that's why the Pandits faced it. No doubt. But there's no denying what happened to the Pandits, and actually I would love to hear more on that issue.
So, firstly, with regard to what Kushagra was saying, I never tried to paint it as like Hindus and Muslims were like at odds in the 1500s. I in fact said the opposite thing, that they were like existing like in peace, and like there was if there was relative harmony, and it was actually a complete harmony. What I said was I don't buy the organic evolution argument, because while that was happening initially, the fact is it was going on at a very slow pace, and a very small percentage of Kashmiris were Muslims at that point of time. When Sikandar Shah sort of took the throne, and when the 80 to 100 year reign of terror started. And my point is, like, during that 80 to 100 years, an area which was largely Hindu majority got converted to a Muslim majority area. That's like obviously an ancillary point and not too relevant to what I'm talking about right now. So, with regard to what happened to the Kashmiri Pandits and like what the army is doing, and like why the army is there, which is another thing I like really disagree with Mukit on. The fact that the army is there to enforce to show the Kashmiris their face because they're protesting against the Indian state. I don't believe the army is there because of that. The army was brought in initially because of the massacre that took place against the Kashmiri Hindus, and it was brought in for that purpose, because the J&K police was not able to maintain law and order in that area, and the J&K police, and the government felt that it was incapable of maintaining that law and order, and that's why it called in the army. And that's a scenario we were in. And I think that's true even today, because the J&K police is not confident of, and I'm in support of the army leaving. In fact, I buy into General V.P. Malik. In fact, wrote about this, and he talked about how it doesn't make sense to have the army is not meant for this purpose. The army is not meant to handle civilians in a domestic setting over an extended period. And gradually, this we should shift from the police doing this from the army doing this to the police performing this role, but then the maintenance of law and order should be with the police at any point of time. And I mean, not a massacre, like ethnic cleansing of the Kashmiris, and like I mean the fact that like they were like the sorry.
I was thinking, you're talking about like a specific incident which led the army being deployed, or
No, not a specific incident, a general breakdown of the law and order machinery in the state, which led the government itself to call in the army. And the fact that like the government acknowledged that it wasn't able to maintain law and order in the area. And I feel the police is the agency that should be doing this. And if the police could do it like really good, and like, it would be a really good thing. And I think 2009 was a great opportunity for us to slowly transition into the police doing it. And like sort of, and like I think Umar Abdullah himself also suggested that like the ASPA be removed from areas such as Jammu, and where like it was largely the J&K police which was in operation. And I mean, I feel that the Indian government has failed in these certain points, like where they could have like sort of I'm not a military expert, and the army and what the central government said was it is up to the army to decide whether like the J&K police is equipped to do this. And like the army said no, like I think the J&K police is not equipped for this, and we need to be in Jammu if it's required, and the ASPA needs to stay in there. And I mean, I don't entirely buy that reasoning. So I mean, I'd be in favor of ASPA being rolled back slowly. But the point is, you need to be sure that the J&K police is capable of handling a law and order situation where there are Kashmiri Pandits sitting in there, and Kashmiri Pandits are secure enough so that they can move from their refugee centers in Jammu, where they're like living in these were people. I mean, you can see the abandoned houses even if you go across Srinagar today. Like they're there, they're abandoned absolutely. Their entire colonies that are abandoned, and that's in Srinagar. So I mean, that's the point. I mean, if you can ensure that these people, if the J&K police is confident that they can. That these people, their safety can be ensured by them, then the army doesn't need to be there. But I don't feel that the J&K police is confident with that, the J&K government is confident with that, or the army is confident with that. And that's because like the J&K government has largely like abdicated its responsibility. It calls in the CRPF, it calls in the army every time there's any problem, like anytime there's any militancy, anytime there's a internal unrest, they call in the CRPF, they call in the army. And now if you expect the CRPF and army to come in without try to handle like civilians, then it's obviously not the best situation for them to be in. Like, I mean, they're not equipped for that, they're not trained for that, they're not locals, they don't understand the people, they don't know who to look for. So, and that's something I agree with Mukit on. The fact that, like, when the army comes in, they don't know who's a terrorist, they don't know who's not a terrorist, they don't know who's harboring militants, who isn't. The people who are better equipped to do that would be the locals. And, like, there'd be people, like, and that's what happened in Punjab. Like, I mean, apart from, like, the fact that KPS Gill was probably, and KPS Gill and Sumedh Saini and the people he deployed were like, they're often not regarded as like the most balanced people, and they were probably like they did inflict a lot of horror stories over there. But like apart from that, the fact was it was a local Sardar who was sort of countering the Khalistan movement, and it was the Punjab police itself which understood the area really well. And because of that, because of the fact that they knew the area, they were able to sort of counter it more effectively, and they weren't like absolute massacres, and the human rights violation were, in my opinion at least, not like that. Not that bad.
Yeah, just to add to Azari, I completely buy his characterization about the army not being deployed because it wants to be there. Now, you need to understand the army is itself not wanting to be in these disturbed areas, because as Azari pointed out, it's not the army's job to be there, it's the job of the civilian forces over there. Now, if you read the text, I don't know how many of you have gone through the AFSPA. Now, you need to understand that you can't just deploy the army wherever you want to deploy the army. You have to see that under the AFSPA itself, the area has to be designated as a disturbed area. That designation comes from the union government. The second caveat is that it always has to be in aid of the civilian forces over there. So unless the civilian forces are not able to perform their function, it is that moment and that juncture at which the army actually steps in. Now you need to now. I was expecting a lot of villainy against the army, which is why I have brought certain figures with myself to substantiate my claims. Now, this is an article that has been written by Mr. Prakash Nanda in the Indian Defence Review, and he is also the author of a very famous book called India's Low-East Policy. Now, according to Prakash Nanda, there were, since 1998, 1,511 cases have been reported against the Indian Army, the military forces specifically. Out of those 1,511 cases, 1,473 cases have been false cases, right? So they have not found any evidence against the army. More importantly, now I'm not saying there have not been any transgressions. I do agree that there have been transgressions, Now, whether there have been transgressions or not, that's basically an institutional problem. Now, you can I mean, I don't know how many of you are over here. I mean, I went to Guwahati in my first year and I was abducted, and that's a very famous story. And Archit and Prasad actually ended up saving me. So what happened? What I'm trying to tell you is, and later it was found out that when I went to IIT Guwahati for a debate and I was abducted, and it was basically a case of extortion, and the police wanted to get some money out of me. That's what I later understood. Now what I'm trying to tell you is that this is an institutional problem which you will face everywhere, right? Now, whether there are transgressions or not, I will agree that there are instances where the army personnel have actually been involved in those transgressions, but you need to understand that that is not something that is state sanctioned, and the state has itself taken cognizance of those transgressions. Just to give you an example, I am very critical of the amnesty, and for the first time I'm probably relying on an amnesty report only. So Amnesty's report in 2015 entitled Denied actually says that there were, and this is an affidavit that was filed by the Jammu and Kashmir government before the Jammu and Kashmir High Court. They said that 458 cases seeking permission to prosecute the army and internal forces. So what happens is, under the AFSP, you need a sanction to prosecute army personnel. That's very similar to the Prevention of Corruption Act and Section 197 of the IPC. You need a sanction to prosecute these state gazetted officers. So out of that 458 cases, out of those 458 cases, 70% of those sanctions have actually been given. And it's very, if you guys are familiar with how the Home Ministry works or how sanctions work, they are not very generous with sanctions. And out of that, 70% of those 458 cases, the sanction for prosecution has been given. More importantly, this is an article written by Lieutenant General Harbans Singh, where and I'll tell you the title of this article. I don't have this article's title, but Lieutenant General Harbans Singh says that there were, between 1995 and 2010, there were 1,400 cases of violations, human rights violations, by not only the army but the security forces in general. Out of those 1,400 cases, only 54, and I quote 54 again, was thought to have some substance. Out of those 54 cases, 37 people have already been punished through a court passage. Now you need to understand here that yes, I do agree that there would have been certain violations, but you need to also understand that it is because of the army that you have certain areas in Kashmir which are still in possession of India, and it is despite the influence from abroad, or despite the nexus from neighboring countries, that it is the army itself that has been able and has been willing to quell this entire problem.
We'll take Shruti, Pranay, and Musharraf's comments in that order.
So I have a question, it's not a comment. I think we've all fairly understood the political issues very well. What I'm really confused about is where religion fits into this. Now I really haven't understood how, apart from the violations that Kashmiri Pandits have faced as a religion, I don't understand where the intersection of the political problems and the religious problems have arisen. So today, for example, in all honesty, Mukesh, do you see in Kashmir hatred towards Hindus, or do you see hatred towards the Indian state? And vice versa, Hazari, do you see hatred towards Muslims or hatred towards, I don't know, for Hindus, we used to live in Kashmir, so I'm not understanding where the intersection happened, how it's playing out today. So
We'll just take the comments.
So it's more into the narrative as to how the 1990s went about. That's why it's a much contested theory, which generally how Jagmohan was instrumental in the alienation between Kashmiri Muslims and Kashmiri Pandits, and how that happened. An idea behind it is there were 4 or 5 very prominent Kashmiri Pandits who were shot dead by either militants or any identified persons. One of them was the guy who was listening AIR's All India Radio at the station, and there was one particular chap, Mr. Paul, I think, second. And what happened was he was trying to utilizing state services, which is the air services, and broadcasting images about the protests that were happening. The state government told him you can't do that, and which effectively clamped down on the argument freedom of speech and expression, which led to one of these Hizbul Mujahideen or somebody else shooting him down. They came out with a statement later on that we don't hate this particular individual. The only reason we had to shoot him was because he denied the access of information and everything else, and was a state instrument in terms of them undertaking their policies. That's one aspect of it, right? It's no justification for what they did. Obviously, it's retarded and wrong, and every circumstance should be condemned. In addition to that, there were three, four other very prominent Kashmiri Pandits who were killed, and this all happened just around early 90s, January 1990. Now, on January 19th, 1990, Jagmohan was reinstated as the governor. That very night, the majority of the exodus happened on January 20th and January 19th, January 20th night. And the thing is, what you need to understand is there was a committee, which the report which I have right now, right, like I was reading it, so it's a fairly well documented account of the Kashmiri narrative. Right, it's not written by any Kashmiri; it's written by 4 individuals who were working in Safdarjung and then came to Kashmir in March 1990. What they did is would try to understand why the conflict arose and why it's been given such a color. So when they went to different places, they asked army officers, they asked Kashmiri Pandits who had been, who were at that particular point in time in March 1990 were living in refugee camps and other such things. What led to this kind of alienation between the two communities? There is an argument, or it's effectively sort of showcased because there are multiple people from the government as well. So for the past a couple of months before this, the government servants, alright, there was an indefinite curfew for quite a while, month-long curfew, which sort of said that which didn't allow people to get their income, alright. But what happened was, even though it's claimed through individual government officers, amongst other things, these people were shipped off. They were provided transport so that they can leave. There were certain, the Kashmiri Pandits, there were certain, I think Hizbul Mujahideen or somebody else did publish in, I think, Al-Safa, and one particular, this thing, what do you call it? They're asking for the Kashmiri Pandits to leave. But if you see the evolution of the narrative right now, any person from Hizbul Mujahideen, even for example Pradhan Wani and others, have categorically denied wanting to remove Kashmiri Pandits or at least anything to do with it. You may call it because it's for the optics, but it has to have a substantial basis. I'm not arguing for Hizbul Mujahideen or anybody else, but you need to understand that Kashmiri Pandits and for the longest time, they're asking them to come back, not in those ghettos that they've been currently supposed to be put in, but otherwise generally as a community, which further leads to. See, the thing is, the problem with fear is that you don't have to have a substantial basis for it. Alright, in case you fear for your life, alright, right now because there will be some fundamentalists who will come and kill me for the views I have. It's a legitimate fear, alright. How do I go about executing? I can at least run away or believe in the state instrumentality to protect me from all these aggressions or these problems which may emulate. So what happens is with regard to Kashmiri Pandits, they had, I'm not disputing the fact, there can be argued there was legitimate fear within them for their life. Even though the IB report specifically specified there were only 11 families who were targeted by militants, Kashmiri Pandit families who were targeted by militants, but you also have to put it in context of the fact that alongside the Mujahideen or the militants went ahead and killed Kashmiri Muslims as well. This is a distinction that I do not want to draw because it's loss of life, alright? And regarding, so this is basic. So once this has happened and these people have been taken to Jammu, there they were provided income, subsistence, like they were given food, even though they didn't, not to the extent that they wanted to, but they were still provided food and resources. And the remaining civil servants were still in Kashmir, the Muslims, who weren't given anything, alright? So if you put it in context, it sort of leads you to understand the alienation that sort of begins to happen, because these people are now viewed as Indian supporters and the fact that they're supporting the Indian cause, very much these guys are going for independence. But yeah.
Okay, I think Hazari.
No, I don't think entirely buy into that characterization either, because the fact is, I mean, you had a situation in the 1990s, there are reports of the fact that, there are Kashmiri Pandit communities were very concentrated and were already microscopic, because, there have been waves of migration. Most of my grandfather and the people who were living in Baramulla and those areas moved out in 46, 45, around that time, because they were forced out by these tribal communities that were coming in from the northwestern frontier province. And after that, you have a situation where, over the years, the Kashmiri population, the Kashmiri Hindus had already dwindled. The population of the Kashmiri Hindus had already dwindled by then. By the time we got to 1990s, it was a very small community. So these are all people who are concentrated in particular parts, and they normally lived as communities. And through these communities, I don't buy the fact that this was violence that was targeted towards everybody, because they came into these communities, they announced they were through megaphones, there were targeted announcements during that time for like Kashmiris to either leave or like prepare to be like, I mean, leave, killed, convert or be killed. And like these announcements were made over like weeks, and like there were megaphones that were going through these areas. And like after that, I mean, these people like, I mean, and there was evidence of people being killed like during, I mean, you can just, I mean, the figures are available for everyone to see. So, and
another aspect of it is I completely agree.
I'm so sorry. We'll just quickly take Prana and Musharraf's comments. And
Hi, my name is Musharraf and I'm from Kashmir and from the most militarized zone of Kashmir, as Azariya said. So I have just few questions to make for our panelists there. Why is there is such extreme lack of political will on all sides regarding the Kashmir issue, and what can we do to address it? Okay. Plus, why is like the Kashmiri life so expendable and like inexpensive? Yeah. So if we have an integral, like if I'm an integral part of Kashmir, like India, then why for me there is like stepmotherly treatment for me, right? So plus like the dehumanization, the brutalization there. Plus the Hazarias made a point that the JK police is incompetent to handle like public outrage there. Like for me, like मैं जहाँ इस जिस area से आ रहा हूँ, मैं मतलब पलहारा plus there's like most militarized zone in Kashmir, right? So what military does, right? As from army perspective, right? उनके पास कुछ ऐसे tear gas shells नहीं होते हैं. So what they do is like simply a live bullet. When there is a public outrage, they just fire a live bullet on the public protest, and that's not the way to handle a public protest, right? So the same amnesty, what Nirod Bhai was talking about, the same amnesty has like few past days back just said there should be a ban on pellet guns, right? Who has just like 600 for the past few days, 600 eye injuries have been caused, and obviously like 150 had like lost their eyesight, right? So I mean, this sort of alienation what Kashmir is like facing right now, but just few hours back मैं अपनी friend से बात कर रहा था अभी, तो उसने बोला आर्मी क्या करती है वहाँ पे, मैं बोलूँगा आर्मी उसने बोला मैं यार अभी घर से भाग गया हूँ, मैं अभी ऐसे ऑर्चर्ड्स में बैठा हूँ, रात भर हम ऑर्चर्ड्स में बैठते हैं बिकॉज राइट मतलब फ्लैग मार्च होता है, राइट मतलब फ्लैग मार्च होता है पूरे एरिया में, और आर्मी में नाइट राइड एसओजी स्पेशल ऑपरेशन ग्रुप्स वर लाइक अनएजुकेटेड पर्सनल्स एंड डजंट नो हाउ टू हैंडल पब्लिक आउटरीच को कैसे हैंडल करना होता है, और उस एरिया को मतलब कैसे हैंडल करना होता है, और फिर हमारे घर में आके हमें लाइक इन दो सेंस वी हैव डन नथिंग फ्रॉम द पास्ट 32 डेज वी इन द कर्फ्यू, राइट? सो आप बाहर नहीं निकल सकते हैं, मतलब मेरे एरिया में 32 डेज से कर्फ्यू चल रहा है, मेरा फ्रेंड बाहर नहीं निकल रहा है, और नाइट में नाइट रेड्स होती है, सीआरपीएफ सिक्योरिटी पर्सनल आर्मी टुगेदर रात में आके मेरे फ्रेंड्स को बाहर निकालते हैं, और दे जस्ट लाइक बुक्ड एंड इन्वॉल्व इन लाइक ऐसे लाइक सबवर्स एक्टिविटीज में इन्वॉल्व को करते हैं, एलिजिड सबवर्स एक्टिविटीज में इन्वॉल्व करते हैं, और फिर बोलते हैं दैट ये जो बंदा है और इसने मतलब स्टून पेल्टिंग की है, ही वाज जस्ट रेजिंग एंटी इंडिया स्लोगन्स, जो एक ऐसे खुद घर में बैठा है वो, राइट? सो ऐसी सिचुएशन को आप कैसे हैंडल करोगे? आप बोल रहे हो यहाँ पे लाइक मीडिया इतना बायस है, मीडिया ये बोल रहा है मतलब मीडिया लाइक टेकिंग द प्रिज्म ऑफ पाकिस्तान, राइट? बट आप ये नहीं दिखा रहे हो वहाँ पे कि जो ह्यूमन राइट्स वायलेशन होती है वो मीडिया कभी नहीं दिखाती है। ह्यूमन राइट्स वायलेशन वहाँ पे मतलब एट्रोसिटीज आर्मी क्या कमिट करती है, वहाँ पे एक 14 ईयर ओल्ड मतलब एक स्टूडेंट है, 14 ईयर गर्ल है, उसमें 300 पैलेट शॉट्स ऑन द फेस शॉट करते हैं, और वो नहीं दिखाते हैं, वो मीडिया नहीं दिखाती है, और सच ए बायस सिस्टम में एक एलिनेशन क्रिएट करते हैं कश्मीरी में और एक आउटसाइड जो रेस्ट ऑफ इंडिया में जो सिटीजन रहते हैं, और इस पर मैं कमेंट
Hi, my views might seem very colored, but I promise you I'm as rational as I possibly can be in my comments. So with that caveat, firstly, I think there's a problem in painting this narrative as the media does not show the atrocities that the Indian government is committing in Kashmir, because I believe that the Western media, specifically the BBC and Reuters, there has been a consistent portrayal of the human rights violations committed solely by India, and not even seeing, because of the North Korea-like administration of Pakistan in the Pakistan-administered region of Kashmir, of the media not even going into what the Kashmiri people themselves are doing in terms of human rights violations towards the armed forces, and secondly, what the Pakistani administration is doing in the Pakistan-administered zone of Kashmir. Secondly, and this is a more fundamental point that I have a problem with,
and that is that the lack of democracy has led to militarization in Kashmir. Now, I have two fundamental problems with that. One, I think there's general agreement that the 1980 period was the time at which this radical Islamicization of Kashmir began. Now, in this light, we must also understand that it was not a lack of internal democracy alone that led to this. A very important factor was the Che Guevara-like brochures that were being spread around Kashmir, specifically the tragedy of Kashmir, which was being sent, and this is something that was quoted not by just Indian organizations or Indian generals, but something like Stanford, who spoke highly about the Pakistan involvement in the Kashmir region during the 1980s when the elections were going on. And in this light, when you have a foreign administered power who is influencing your domestic policy to an extent that it portrays Kashmiri individuals as not only victims but as aliens to the Indian state, I believe it's a serious problem if you refuse to recognize this as an issue of, if you see this only as an issue of internal democracy and not see the foreign power that is involved over here. And I think that is a very important consideration. And finally, the issue that I again had a problem with, and let me oversimplify this to an extent that it becomes absurd, is that when you say that Burhan Wani, it comes from a place where I can understand, I have a problem with that because I cannot understand Burhan Wani. And the reason for that is simply because he is a well-educated individual who comes from a respected family. I can very easily say Osama bin Laden had a master's degree in economics. He believed that the United States was oppressing Islam, and therefore he is justified in doing his terrorist acts. But I don't think any rational individual would engage in those. Yeah, you want to?
I'll start with that because
yeah.
There's a difference between understanding and condoning. Alright, understand that first distinction. Secondly, the reason why I can understand where Burhan Wani comes from is because you haven't lived under occupation. Alright, and it's a fair, like it's a just general point. Alright, the reason why that at the end of the day, in case of any activity that you may commit, like for example, go and have a chocolate bar outside your house, you may be killed for that owing to the fact that you may have defied certain ideas or whatever else it is. Just walking outside, that kind of oppression internalizes, or do you like that's a fundamental aspect of it, and in no way my understanding of it can be argued to be agreeing with him. I understand where Savarkar came from. I understand where Mahatma Gandhi came from and Jinnah came from, but that doesn't in no way condones their actions.
Yeah. Sorry, Mukeet, now let me just, I agree with what you're saying right now, but let me tell you what the problem, like, for me, in my understanding of your understanding.
Yeah.
The problem is that I see this understanding as a justification. And the reason for that is simply because I feel when you say, and when Arvind says specifically, that there were lakhs of people who came to the funeral, we need to know the reason why they were there. And that is a justification and not an understanding.
Okay, so that's where I draw a distinction. That is, you have an intellectual background which believes that understanding equates to justification. Mine doesn't. My intellectual background is I try and understand the problem and what caused the problem, and that may sort of lead you to an answer. Alright. So there's this whole neoliberal idea that you take a social issue and employ a security solution, which is a fundamentally wrong thing to do, which is sort of arguably what has happened here. Another reason why I sort of agree with Lekhi on an earlier point that he made, that it's the institution that exists that sort of has a violation which allows you to commit these violations. The fact that complete impunity under AFSPA allows you to undertake whatever actions you can without any recourse, that sort of gives you the right or the legitimacy in such an environment to do whatever you can and sort of perpetuate the kind of biases that you may have in physical form. You may have certain biases against certain people. You may not be able to do anything about it, consider the fact you're limited by the law and order structure that exists within here. In Kashmir, that sort of bias can be sort of reflected upon. There are parts of this, I really would want you to read this committee report so that you can understand. I may not be able to put it better, but this committee on the initiative of Kashmir called the India's Kashmir War, it sort of will tell you or make you understand, if you want to understand, and not lead that to a justification as to where this comes from. Another aspect of it, which I really have to point out before I go into this, is the fact that the transgressions committed by the army, arguably, that you may call them transgressions, but in the Indian sources, 40,000 people, and from Korean sources, 90,000 people killed. along with the fact that some 60,000 arguably tortured, 10,000 detained, cannot be argued to be minor transgression. It's a
I just want to make a few comments before we move into this. We've discussed the problem thread, where we have to also discuss the solutions. But before going into that, I just want to make a few points. No one denies the fact of Pakistan's involvement, but merely the reason why I harp more on the internal dimensions because I believe the media today, while all of us here probably know about Pakistan's role, very few of us know about what we have done, right? What the government of India has done, and that's the whole reason. It doesn't mean that we ignore what Pakistan has done. Another point, what Utkarsh I think mentioned about why can't we hold individuals accountable? Why not the state? Like when we talk about Ikwanis and Ajit Doval, who's going to hold them accountable? The government of India, right? Am I going to hold accountable or the civilians? The government of India holds them accountable. The government of India has not done that, and that is the problem. I'm so sorry, but and then of course there was a mention of the villainy of the army. I want to make it very clear here: the army is not at fault for what has happened right now because. Take any situation, wherever you put the armed forces over a long period of time, atrocities are inevitable. Take the Vietnam War, when the US Army was there, they were there for such a long time. My Lai massacre happened. And when Musharraf particularly talks about why don't they, why, for example, they said, pellets are non-lethal weapons. They're non-lethal if you don't shoot it on the face. If you shoot it on the shin or something, that's non-lethal. It's more about also police reforms. These are, we don't even have a conversation about this, let alone in parliament, let alone anywhere. And that's the main issue there. And one more thing about the army. I'm not going into the amnesty figures, anything of that sort, because we don't have time. I would love to do that. But I also come from an army background. My grandfather fought in 3 wars and he died in the 71. So I meet a lot of army people due to that connection. And I've met a lot of army personnel who have served in Kashmir. War widows I've met who lost their husbands there. And let me tell you, it's the reason the army is there because we haven't found a political solution. We're not there to, justify this, justify that. No. The issue is there's a political solution problem there, and that needs a political solution. And just look at our language. We speak. Kashmir is an integral part of India's territory. Let us change the language to say Kashmiris are an integral part of our country. Let us, when a Kashmiri dies, let's not just look at it as some statistic. That's an Indian as well. And when a Kashmiri today leaves Kashmir and he goes there, he's also discriminated, right? So these are areas which we need to address, and I really think we should also talk about the solutions we can find in these cases.
I think we'll just quickly entertain Archit's comment as the last comment. We won't entertain comments from people twice. Then I think we should move on to solutions. This is the final segment.
Okay, I'll try and keep it as short as possible. I'll also try and add sort of start off louder. Yeah, so I'll keep it as short as possible. But I think it's interesting that when at the time when we were talking about 1980s Kashmir and when we were debating what led to the sort of emergence of religious strife, I think it was interesting that our conversation immediately went to Quran Wani, and there was a 25-year sort of gap in the middle that we just switched, because the problem here, I mean, at least at a personal level, the problem I see is that there is far too much of a focus on trying to understand why people went for Quran Wani's funeral. I mean, I personally think, and I'm talking as someone who, for example, my father was in the Indian Army, and he passed away when I was 4 years old. He passed away at the forefront. He was in Kashmir, fighting in Kashmir. So I grew up thinking, okay, I'm going to get into the army and I'm going to take revenge for my dad. And different versions of that, right? Except by the time I came to college or around that time, I realized that and I think Arvind pointed this out, I think we've all had different levels of whitewashing in the kind of narrative that we've got about Kashmir. And we can completely sit down and dispute what's correct, what's not correct, what kind of narrative you had. But I really think that the sort of narrative that you get about Hyderabad and the Nizam of Hyderabad in your school history / pol science textbooks is very different from the kind of narrative that you get about Kashmir. I think there are crucial facts that are left out with regard to the Kashmiri narrative, whether it be the instrument of accession, whether it be the annexure to the instrument of accession and how it was conditional on plebiscite, etc., etc. And that's why I think it's problematic the moment we say we don't understand why anybody would go to Quran Wani's funeral. Because we simply, I mean, as Mukeet said, we haven't lived that life, or at least most of us haven't lived that life. I find it very, very reasonable to understand that that people use symbols of resistance as something that would automatically act as something that pisses their oppressor off, right? So I think it's completely fine for anybody in Kashmir to necessarily assume that the army, the judiciary, that government sitting in Delhi is all a part of one whole. It's a part of one state that oppresses them. Whether their reasons for thinking so are correct or incorrect, I don't think it's up for us to decide. I mean, and this is where I want to sort of tag off solutions and hope that you guys take this on, is that I feel that as a country that has tried to espouse Tibet's cause for so long, that sort of flirted around the idea of doing that for Tamils in Sri Lanka, that also wanted to do this for Sikkim and Nagaland, but then sort of also took the knee. I think I want to see how can we at this moment harmonize our apparent respect for self-determination and this narrative that Kashmir and hopefully Kashmiris are an integral part of India.
Thank you, Anchit. I think we should move on to the next segment, which is solutions. We're really running out of time. Mohit?
If you really want to ask any Kashmiri what you want, it's basically going to be independence. I contest the notion insofar as that the political reality of such independence can be disputed. An arguable solution can be that Kashmir can be as an integral, you unite Kashmir, the two halves of Kashmir, but this is just purely, I'm talking in terms of impossibility, because considering the fact the kind of debate we're having at every level is devoid of any kind of aspiration of the Kashmiri individual. Arguably, it would be independent Kashmir, which would operate nicely with both India, Pakistan, and China, and would allow for greater integration between three nations who have not much reason to be against each other, apart from the fact that historical wrongs committed by the other country. That's one aspect of it. The other is, if I talk in terms of real politics, or like understanding, like if you want to take it the way it is, I would argue the basic thing that the Kashmiri mind, and this is me supposing what the Kashmiri mind understands, which I don't necessarily know, would be a reversion or going back to the notion of a greater amount of autonomy in terms of most of its administration, something along the lines of an Article 370, which actually is Article 370, and is there for the intents and purposes it was created, and that sort of would possibly allow for a change in the way the nation is.
When you're looking at good solutions, and it may take a little bit of time, but I'll just quickly go through what I think are some essential things. First of all, there needs to be a dialogue, which is not happening right now. Okay, that's the first step, at least, towards a solution. But what are the solutions according to me? One, we really have to, South Africa, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which looked at all the cases of atrocities which are committed in the apartheid regime. We need a similar sort of mechanism in Kashmir. We need to review all these cases. There are numerous massacres of both sides. I'm not saying we don't look at the militancy atrocity. Let's look at both sides, okay? Another thing is, we have enough and more material on various things we could do. We had the JNK interlocutors report. One of the interlocutors, I had a long discussion with Dr. Radhakumar about her report. And they've discussed, for example, one solution is the Constitutional Committee, which is talking about a review of all the laws we put after 1953. 1953, because that's the time we made our first breach of the promises. And just review, are all the laws we put to Kashmir necessary? The ones which are necessary for economic or security purposes, let them be there. But let's start a review somewhere, right? And another thing and that's one, the interlocutors report came out in 2010. The government of India did nothing. There's the JNK Assembly passed a resolution in 2000 asking for let's go back to the 1953 status. But the Delhi government just rejected that instead of not even having a discussion on the topic. We need a discussion on these matters. And this, I'll quickly go through in case anyone wants to talk to me differently about this. You can, because we don't have time. The issue is about the role of Pakistan, because let's understand three premises. One very important fact is, if we need to find a lasting solution to Kashmir, Pakistan role is important. We cannot ignore that fact, as much as we'd like to look at the internal dimensions. And there are three basic premises. India cannot crush those who are seeking for justice or whatever, or even Azadi in Kashmir with force. The Kashmiris cannot oust India with force, and the Pakistanis cannot win Kashmir with force. Okay, these are three basic premises we have to understand. And there is the back channel talks are an essential for that. And it's not that these back channel talks are redundant, Pakistan always goes back on its word. There were actually quite great progresses we made. And that's something I had a long discussion with the former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh on this topic when we were talking about the formula. Manmohan Singh and Musharraf came together, and he of course gave me a very brief idea of the formula, and I can, if we have time, I would love to elaborate upon it. But some of the points I would say is, one, after 3 years of parley, and this is not just with the Musharraf government, it's also with the army, with General Pasha of the ISI, and with our IB and the RAW, we had an agreement on it's called the 4-point formula. One is demilitarization. Second is maximum autonomy on both sides. Another issue is India has statedly told, the Pakistani government, we are not going to change borders. And the Pakistani government has a thing about the LOC being the international boundary or the border. They came to an agreement that let LOC be the border. We give up this entire claim of POK, and that's as early as Nehru said in 1948. Give up the claim of POK. Pakistan give up the claim over Indian administered Kashmir. And while we have a lot of, we should have forces definitely by the Gilgit and Ladakh areas where you have the boundaries with China. Demilitarize from the urban areas and make the LOC what the whole concept of soft borders. The LOC, there are numerous families in Kashmir which have been separated, and they really they need a movement between together. Making the LOC almost irrelevant, whereby Kashmiris from that side and this side can move without visas. Okay, that doesn't mean they can enter India like into Punjab and thing, because those areas, of course, will have a separate border check. But making the LOC slightly irrelevant. And in fact, do you know why we had the maximum fall of terrorist infiltration between 2004 and 2008? It was because during the time Pakistan, General Musharraf in particular, wanted to show his earnestness in this regard. And they had controlled the militancy. In fact, in the first time in back channel talks, Musharraf admitted to the fact that we are the ones in charge of these militants. And, de-radicalization centers were set to be formed. India and Pakistan for the first time had a joint survey over, Siachen Glacier. We nearly had an agreement on that matter as well. Then there's, on the question of maximum self-governance. So basically, it's just a return to the erstwhile princely states of Jammu and Kashmir. You have maximum autonomy on both sides. It's not full independence, and let's agree, if you look at the economics, independence is near impossible for that area. But it's not full independence, but at the same time, it's restoring that special status by which Kashmir acceded to us. And it's a restoration to that. Now, I don't think we have enough time for me to go into too much detail, but because I nearly had quite a long discussion with the Prime Minister on this topic, but I'll be more than happy to discuss this with anyone who wants to talk on it. Because I know initially it sounds very, utopian, these ideas of demilitarization, things like that, but there's actually a very detailed discussion on this topic. And if anyone's very interested to read about it, please read the former Pakistani Foreign Minister's book, Neither a Hawk Nor a Dove, Khurshid Qusuri's book. It gives a lot of detail. It's like an 800-page book. My poor friend had to buy it for me as a gift, and it was almost around 800,000-page book. So it looks like a huge document of sorts. But yeah, we'll go ahead. Yeah.
So maybe you could talk to Arun later.
So, according to
I'm sorry, you want please,
Yeah, I'll try to be as short as I can, though I have a lot to say. So just to cut a long story short, I will first tell you, I'll start with what I do not think is a solution, and then I'll go to what I think is a solution. I don't think removal of the AFSPA at this juncture is a solution at all. I think the militants have an extremely elaborate intelligence grid. They are very potent. And especially in light of what has happened in the Kashmir Valley of late, I do not think the removal of the AFSPA can at all be a solution. Now I agree, and I may dispute the figures that have been, I don't know the source of 60,000 deaths and all that Wukil spoke about right now. I don't know if that source is a viable source or not, because it's Hurriyat, and I personally think you said
I gave both.
Yeah, I don't know.
Indian government said 60.
Okay, fine. So I don't think it is a solution as of now. Now the reason I say it is, and I don't think that the army has an unfettered power to do whatever it wants to. Even under the current even at this juncture, you had the Naga People's Movement versus the Union of India case in the Supreme Court in 1998, where the constitutional bias of the FSPA was challenged, and there the court gave categorical instructions to the army and said that whenever you want to declare an area as a disturbed area, you should consult the state government also, because under the AFSPA, it's only the central government. It also said that the soldiers themselves cannot exercise this power in a very unfettered manner. It also said that there are many checks and balances within the AFSPA, where if you look at section 3 of, I can't recall it, where there are caveats that have been given while exercising those shoot to sight orders, such as if you see those people who are carrying arms or they have ammunition, those are the caveats within that section itself. Secondly, I don't think plebiscite at all is a solution. I don't think that, I think the plebiscite to start with, I think it was a construction of some vivid imagery of Mountbatten, where he had supposedly added this caveat to the instrument of accession, where that was never the case. Even if there were to be a plebiscite, I'm taking that hypothetical. If we look at the UN resolution on Kashmir, it had two caveats before the plebiscite has to be held. The first was that there has to be a ceasefire. The second was that Pakistan has to withdraw its army, and India reserves the right to have its army still in Kashmir to ensure that there is law and order. And it is only after that that the people of Kashmir will have a right to decide upon their will. Now, till these two things happen, I don't think a plebiscite, an argument of a plebiscite can be entertained at all. Now, when these two things do happen, I think then possibly you can talk about a possible plebiscite. But till these two things happen, I don't think it's a viable solution. Finally, I'll just recap what Arvind had also said. I do agree with the fact that the interlocutor report that was where Mr. Dilip Patgaonkar was also involved. There were certain viable solutions that were offered in the interlocutor report, where he had said that a review of the central laws needs to take place. Now, what's also what you need to understand is that the state government in Kashmir actually lacks a lot of funds, and for that they are recommended that you need to harness the hydroelectricity power in Kashmir, which is not being harnessed at all. There are uranium deposits in Kashmir which you can exploit also, and through which you can actually enrich the state. I think these are very viable solutions. I also think that, and he spoke about Kasuri. Now, Khurshid Ahmed Kasuri had, and he very rightly said that by 2007 they did have a possible working plan in force. Now, one of the suggestions that Khurshid Ahmed Kasuri was the foreign minister of Pakistan at that time was that you need to ensure that there's a ceasefire. You need to ensure that there is an element of demilitarization that takes place on both ends, and you need to harness the trade routes that are going from India to Pakistan and Pakistan to India, so that the regions of Azad Kashmir and Kashmir do get an element of revenue. Now, finally, I think I don't think, and this is something I completely do not buy. Actually, I clash on something that Arvind had pointed out. It was a special status of Kashmir that made them accede to us. That was never the case. The instrument of accession was signed on 26th October 1948. Article 306A, which is now read as Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, was actually entertained 2 years later in 1949, as late as 1949, because they acknowledged that there was a special circumstance that was prevailing in Kashmir, and therefore it was not conditional upon the special circumstance that Kashmir actually acceded to India. The 306A or 370, as we know it, was never even in debate when they acceded to India, and therefore it was not because they were wanting to grant Kashmir a special status that Kashmir actually ended up acceding to India. Finally, I think that the issue of Kashmiri Pandits is something that is always ignored in terms of their rehabilitation. Now, one of the solutions that the Kashmiri Pandits have themselves wanted, which you could perhaps characterize as ghettoization, is that they want a Panoon Kashmir, which means a separate area in Kashmir which could possibly designated as a union territory, where these Kashmiri Pandits can live before they can actually get harmonized within the Kashmiri narrative and within the Kashmiri setup. Now, the reason they are saying this is because you need to understand that after their exodus in the 90s, certain very important aspects of their culture, such as their cuisines, such as their folk song, they have all died. And for them to prosper, you need to let them prosper in a different area, and you cannot in any way integrate them to the current setup. That's finally. And the reason I say this is because even after the protests of Burhan Wani, you had Kashmiri Pandits who were living in a camp in Pulwama who were actually targeted. Now you can say that the Kashmiris want Pandits to come back, but an article in the Times of India dated November 1st, 2015, and you can check this. The council for the government of Jammu and Kashmir had, before the Supreme Court of India, submitted in an affidavit that only one Kashmiri Pandit family has actually returned to the Kashmir Valley. And you need to understand why only one Kashmiri Pandit family has actually returned to the Kashmir Valley. It is because there's a very hostile environment still prevailing there, which is why I cannot agree with the fact that you need to do away with the FSPA. I do not agree that there needs to be a plebiscite over here. And you also finally need to understand that Kashmir itself is a very diverse area. Kashmir, we have, what's very surprising over here is that we have not at all spoken about Ladakh over here. Ladakh is actually a bigger area than the Kashmir has been worked in. It has a very heterogeneous culture. It has a very heterogeneous ethnic life, and therefore you need to understand all these things. Now I'll just take one more minute, and I will tell you that actually I'll just concede. Okay, go ahead.
I'll just keep it really short. So basically, what I believe is that any long-term resolution for Kashmir must come from within. I don't have any grand ideas of a united Kashmir. So I feel like it has to be the Kashmiri government which needs to sort of realize that it's abdicated responsibility in the past. It needs to like sort of take charge and like say that they're going to like they need to sort of enforce the law and order. It has to be the J&K police. It cannot be the army in perpetuity. And I mean, for that the J&K police needs to be well trained enough, and that's something that they haven't looked at. It has to be a Kashmiri in charge of the J&K police. It cannot be an IPS officer from somewhere else in India. So that I mean, it gets some credibility and the locals buy into it. That's what happened in Punjab, and I feel that's what's required there. But till that's not possible, till the J&K government doesn't do this, what India also needs to understand is we are also responsible for this territory if we consider it our own. And like if the army is deployed there, and like if it is performing civilian function, and if it has to do that, then we need to sort of make some concessions on that front. We need to if the ASPA has to be rolled back, the plan that Omar Abdullah came up with to roll it back in stages is something I buy into. Apart from that, I also believe that you can't use pellet guns. So if they're operating in civilian areas, I understand the army doesn't normally procure like water cannons or some other like normal things that deal with civilian areas. But if you're consistently performing that role in Kashmir, you can't say we're the army, we don't do this. You have to sort of go and realize that pellet guns can be dangerous, use something else. And apart from that, when they operate, certain the Verma committee made some recommendations regarding how rape, if in case of rape, how they should be proceeded against in a civilian court. And I think that's pretty reasonable. Something as major as rape, it can be seen as an olive branch, and the Kashmiri people at least will feel like they're trying to do something about it. And it's a minor concession to make. It's only cases of rape and something like that.
Arjun has one final.
Very quick, I'm so sorry. It's just on the factual point with Lake, and I don't want to argue it here, we can discuss it again. It's just about the special status of Kashmir that, clause 7 of the Instrument of Accession. I'll just read out one part. Nor does it fetter my discretion to enter into agreement with the Government of India under any future constitution. That agreement was the Delhi Agreement of July 1952, and then later on, before that, the Article 370. Where does the special status of Article 370 come? Article 371b3, Article 371d, and Article 372. And then, of course, there's a Supreme Court judgment, 5-judge bench in the case of Premnath Kaur versus State of Jammu and Kashmir, 5-judge bench, which again talks about the special status of Jammu and Kashmir. But we'll really have another. We'll discuss in the room.
We'll also go read Article 3 of the Constitution of Kashmir. That's all.
Article 3 of the Constitution of Kashmir of the Constitution of Kashmir clearly states that we are an integral part of Kashmir. No one is saying that you can be an integral part and yet have a special status. That is what is the
Okay, thank you so much. I think Kais has something to say now.
Okay, guys, we really thank you all for coming, and the LTS was very happy with the enthusiastic participation from everyone, and we hope you come in the future. I'd like to thank the panel, Abhimanyu, Anirudh, Abraham, and also Hita for moderating. We really appreciate it.